Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today I'm going to give my honest to God opinion on whether or not I think that we are close to nuclear war. Now, I say that out the gates because this is going to be more of a meandering rant, and quite frankly, this is only a video for those who are hyper attentive to the events as they unfold in the Kherson Oblast, which is a region of Ukraine which is now acting as somewhat of a demarcation line between east and west. It borders a river that basically cuts Ukraine in two. And it looks like this is shaping up to have everything west of the river be in Ukraine and NATO's possession, and everything to the right of the river quite possibly being in the hands of the Russians, or at least most of that. Now, we need to sometimes go back to first principles thinking when trying to understand a war like this, where there are so many unanswered questions. So many things just simply do not make sense. For starters, why is the United States there in the first place? Well, many people have theories with respect to why. Why is it that the Eurozone is decapitating itself in an industrial sense? Why is Europe shooting itself in the foot by now restricting its access to incredibly cheap energy, an unlimited supply of cheap energy, which would help its economy grow and expand? Why is it doing this? Why is it so important that we pour hundreds of billions of dollars into this conflict? That is the question. Some people say, oh, it's a conspiracy by the Americans to basically make the Eurozone their bitch. That's what some people think, okay, more or less. I'm not going to get into the nuance of that, but that's what some people think. I've long since suspected that hundreds of billions of dollars may seem like a lot of money. However, you need to also consider that if the petrodollar was to fail as a result of Russia establishing itself as a global player, and of course you'll notice that in 2014 the Russian economy was roaring. It was I think it went up to like 3 trillion or something, or close to that, 2.5 trillion. And then after that 2014 situation as it unfolded in Ukraine, of course, this is when things started to quickly devolve for the Russian economy. Now, why is that? Okay, so and we're going to get to the Kherson situation, because my immediate thing, the first thing I did, and this might seem strange to some people who are of a geopolitical analytical ilk, you might ask yourself, why on earth would you do such a silly thing? Well, the first thing I did when I heard that the Russians were retreating from Kherson, I went on to Google News and I searched for Ramzan Kadyrov, Kherson. And I selected some of the options, the tools, and ordered it by date, descending. Okay, and because I want to know what's the most current story. And the reason why I did this is because I wanted to know how he was going to react. Because this guy has historically been one of the most aggressive, belligerent actors in the military ranks of the Russian government. And now, of course, third or fourth in line or something like that. And so I was waiting for him to come out and condemn this move. Because in the same way that he did that in Kharkov, and in a place where the Russians were firmly established, in a place where they were effectively, had stabilized the lines for the most part, there wasn't any major offensives or major gains by the Ukrainians in the recent days. They were protecting the bridges and the dam with their missile defense systems. The Ukrainians couldn't destroy the bridge that the Russians used. In fact, the Russians destroyed the bridge when they just left just today. So I went and searched to see what this guy was saying about this. And lo and behold, he's praising the whole operation as if it's, one of the greatest military decisions ever made. The same guy who, when the Russians retreated from Kharkov, talked about how disappointed he was, and the same guy who just had a few platoons of soldiers wiped out recently, is suddenly on board with this, as is the leader of the Wagner Group, who's the private kind of Blackwater-like company who's done a lot of the fighting for Putin in this war. And they're both surprisingly yay for this move. And, for the longest time, the Ukrainians have been talking about, well, maybe this is just a ruse. Maybe this is just a feint maneuver by the Russians to try to bait us in and entrap us into making concentrating our forces and into a place where they're just going to light it up. And this is what you would presume would happen. But today I'm watching the news and I'm seeing this parade of civilians cheering on all of these Ukrainian soldiers coming into the town of Kherson the day after the elections. This all was initiated. Literally, the day after the elections, they declared. And that was no coincidence. That was clearly planned. They talked about this for many, many weeks. They primed the population. They got people ready for the move. Now, they're going to say because we couldn't resupply and yada, yada, yada. And all the Russia bros are going to be like, as they usually do, it's never strategic when they lose territory, when the Russians lose territory, but it's always strategic when they gain territory. Okay? And you got people like the Duran, who people are calling the Oracle for some reason. I don't understand how, because this is the same guy who insisted that the Russians would never invade in the first place and has been dead wrong about, time and time again. Even Scott Ritter, the day before the Kherson retreat, was saying that this would be political suicide for Putin. And that he would never, authorize a Kherson offensive, that they were making gains, they were holding the line, they were, had a 8 to 1 kill ratio. So why would they? And then the day after, like clockwork, okay, this guy, Scott Ritter, comes on and says that, what does he say? He says, it just makes sense, like, of course you would retreat. It makes perfect strategic, tactical, whatever sense, right? Why would you can't resupply and you don't want to have all your troops surrounded. And I'm not saying there's not an argument to be made there, especially if they're going to nuke the dam, not nuke in a literal sense, maybe, but especially if the Ukrainians were to get a few missiles past and the dam blew and the region flooded out, okay, and the whole right bank would be flooded out and they would be trapped there. And then they would be surrounded by Ukraine. And then, of course, all of that equipment and all of those POWs would be in the hands of Ukraine. So you can make that argument. But the fact that this has all happened so seamlessly, and then the day after it happens, they're celebrating in the streets. Now, for starters, okay, don't you think that if the Ukrainians were really concerned that this was a trap, maybe they wouldn't be parading a bunch of civilians through the streets if this is a war zone that's likely going to be lit up? And don't you think that the Russians would be trying to do that as they retreated? So why, oh why, is this not happening? Well, I think that maybe there was some kind of tentative, temporary deal made in the back channels, in the upper echelons between the United States and Russia, that if we retreat across this river, okay, if we go back and maybe you guys can have everything left of the river, okay, you can have everything and you can have access to the sea, and we'll have to the right of the river. Okay, and that means that we're going to continue our offensive as they're doing in Bakhmut and other places in the Donbass. They're making advances still. Perhaps part of the deal was that they get to take Kharkov, or maybe, who knows? Who knows what else? Because right now, as it stands, Ukraine currently has soldiers in annexed territory. They've always had soldiers in what Russia considers Zaporozhye, however you want to pronounce it. I'm going to butcher every single name, I promise. The city of Zaporozhye, they have the power plant, but they don't have the city. And so there's a big chunk of these territories that the Russians are no longer in, but they call it their homeland. So where is the big response to all of this? Something isn't right here. There has been some sort of agreement made. Now, do I think that any agreement that's been made is going to stick? No. The only other alternative I can think of is that why on earth, if this isn't the case, why are all these civilians still in Kherson in the streets if this is going to be a potential trap and a war zone that we need to proceed reluctantly. Now, it was very surprising to me that the media didn't really make as big a deal of this as I thought they would. At least not in the beginning. When they got there, okay, they started to put some attention on it, but they did not make as big of a deal of it as I thought. Now, I don't know, you would think that would be, that they would play it up a little bit more than they did, but maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe they actually have, and I'm just not paying enough attention to the headlines. But it seemed like it was a little understated for what it was, for how significant of a victory it was, because now, of course, this puts Crimea in the crosshairs. It puts a lot of critical Russian assets in the crosshairs, and quite frankly, unless that river freezes like 4 or 5 meters thick, like some people say it does, I don't see how it's going to freeze that much, because we have a river here in the Saskatchewan River that doesn't even freeze. It's not a very fast-flowing river in many parts. It freezes over a little bit in some spots, but you can drive a truck over it. Can you drive tanks? Can you drive heavy equipment? Now, I don't know, they're saying, but I know it doesn't get nearly as cold, and especially close to the Black Sea. I'm presuming it's more of like a temperate climate, so I doubt that the entire river is going to freeze, or freeze in such a way that they'd be able to attack it through the Kherson front. So what I'm saying is that either the Russians are, really planning for a big major winter offensive, or there's been some kind of deal made. Now, I'm hoping, of course, that some kind of deal has been made, and that maybe this is partly why this, and they're saying it's because the inflation numbers were low, and all of these things just happened, coincidentally in the same few days. You had the inflation numbers come out that were very low, well, relatively low. They're still high. It's what they call disinflation. So it's still inflation, but it's just not as high of inflation as it was the previous month or what it was expected. But things are still inflating in price. And you had the election that had just concluded, and all of a sudden this withdrawal from Kherson. And so it all just seemed kind of scripted. And then you had the market spike big time, and you had the dollar drop big time. Like flick of a switch. The markets went up because really the dollar crashed. So really, theoretically, because the market's measured in dollars and the dollar declined correspondingly almost to the exact same degree that the markets went up, did you really gain anything in your portfolio when your American dollars are worth less? Not really, no. And the same thing happened with gold. So the American dollar, the USD index, declined something like 7%, and the markets went up, pretty much the same amount in that period of time, as did the price of gold and oil and other things like that, and other commodities. So all of these things happen at the same time. People are saying, well, was it because of the inflation, low inflation numbers, which indicate that maybe the Fed is going to reduce interest rates? Probably, maybe. Or it's to do with the fact that maybe the markets or somebody in the higher up in the know knows that maybe the war is going to be frozen for a little bit. And literally. Is it going to be frozen forever? No, absolutely not. I'm almost 100% convinced that the Russians are going to commit to a major invasion. For starters, they've mobilized all these troops. They're not doing that for no reason. They're still expelling U.S. diplomats. They're still preparing bunkers in Moscow. There was an article that just came out on Bloomberg that talked about that. They're refurbishing bunkers, and they're doing it in secret. They're still putting sanctions on various U.S. People and the individuals in the U.S. and U.S. companies. And of course, the oil, the oil price cap is still taking effect in December. There's still all these things that are showing, signs of escalation. They're still sending copious amounts of weapons and equipment and money and funding into this into this conflict. And because there's now this lame duck Congress, which is about to turn over, quite possibly both the Senate and the House, although I think the last I looked, it was likely, it was looking likely, according to mainstream media, that the Democrats might win the Senate, but by the time this video comes out, that could all change, and maybe they'll win both. Regardless, foreign policy is not going to change as a result of the election. Foreign policy will stay the same as it always does. And we're just one major event away from that nail just being driven into the coffin. And when I mean an event, I mean something happening that grabs the attention of the average person and garners more support for the conflict. Because guys, it's going to be a long, dark winter for Europe. When those wells start to run dry, that's when reality is going to sink in. The Russians have been incredibly patient right now. You have the Americans who are on the border. You have the Crimean Bridge that was blown up. Okay, this was supposed to be this red line. You blow up the Crimean Bridge, as Dmitry Medvedev said, it's the four horsemen of the apocalypse and it's going to be Armageddon, yada, yada, yada. They blew up Nord Stream. They claimed to have evidence, like the envoy to who's in the UK right now says we have direct evidence that implicates, not only implicates, but proves that you orchestrated it, the UK, that you took out this $20 billion pipeline, this critical infrastructure, okay, which was an act of war. And what have they got in return? Now they have these troops on their territory, or what they consider their annexed territory, and yet they've done nothing. Now, according to David Pine, they're planning something. They're planning something big. Perhaps they're just biding their time by having some sort of tentative agreement with that Jake Sullivan was able to broker with, was it Patrushev? Is that the other guy, foreign affairs guy? But in Russia, I don't know. I really don't know what's going on. It's one of those two things, though, that the Russians are regrouping and preparing to do a major invasion in the north. And then what they would do is they would effectively, because you can cross the river, there's smaller river crossings in the north. So it could be that this whole bolstering of forces in the north around Belarus is the final plan. They're planning on going down into Kiev. Maybe, as David Pine has indicated, detonating some EMP weapon over Kiev, blacking the place out. We have Kiev talking about evacuating 3 million people. That's very suspicious. And, you know, evacuating them to where? Well, it would be to Western Ukraine, I presume. But if there was some sort of deal, what did Russia get in return? Now, you could say that the Russians have had some significant gains. Well, many significant gains. I mean, Crimea itself is a treasure trove of resources and industry, as well as Zaporozhye, and the Donbass is a huge industrial hub, and there's trillions in resources in these regions. So if that's all the Russian gain, you could say that was gain, but to me, it still falls short of a lot of expectations. And I don't know how Putin is, you know, his favorability ratings haven't declined more significantly. Now, according to TASS, which is basically the state-sponsored media organization, the most formal one anyways in Russia, they're saying that his approval ratings haven't declined at all that much. Well, you know, you really have to take that with a grain of salt. Like I say, a lot of the pro-Russian people, who I understand they're trying to compensate for a very, very pro-Western bias in analyzing the situation. I cannot stand the people who are just, you know, Ukraine, you know, with no deeper curiosity about why these things emerge in the first place. I can't stand those people. But I also can't stand the people who are like just minimizing everything, every blunder that the Russians apparently make. Now, that all said, this could be Austerlitz, right? This could be just like Napoleon did in Austerlitz, how he retreated and he feigned weakness in order to bait the Russians into attacking. I believe it was the Russians. And I actually have the the story here. I could read it to you, I suppose. But this is a common tactic, especially in maneuver warfare, is that you would want to bait people in and make them think you are weak. But the thing is about making it, the Austerlitz thing only works if you really, really sell it. You know, you can't just be like, oh, I guess we're going to have to retreat now. No, you need Ramzan Kadyrov to be like, yes, this was a great decision. You have to really make it look. And then you have to go steps and steps further to make it appear as though, yes, you really are running out of weapons. And you really are having to buy weapons from Iran and North Korea and buy more missiles from these places in order to, you know, bait your enemy into a fight. It's just like hustling at a pool table. You know, it's like pretending you suck and then playing for money. You know, that's really what it is. And this is why a lot of people have been saying, well, where's all the good Russian equipment? Where's all the more advanced fighter jets? Where's all the Kinzhal missiles and the hypersonics and stuff like this? And why aren't they using, you know, I mean, there's just so much technology that they could be employing more readily. They could be using EMP weapons right now, you know, very low yield nukes. And it probably wouldn't even elicit it would cause some immediate panic, but I think it would quickly become normalized. Now, if they use tactical nukes for their explosive impact to destroy actual hardware and troops, then that might be another story. But an EMP, you know, there's still a lot of mysticism about that. And as long as there wasn't as many casualties, then maybe people would not care about that so much. But I really don't know what to think. I will say that in the last couple of days, I've been somewhat more hopeful that this situation might be remedied, at least in the short term. But in the long term, you still have China-Taiwan cranking up. And that could very well be why the United States is trying to refocus on that, yet they're still trying to put through this extra $50, $60 billion package through Congress before the Republicans take over everything, even though I don't think that's going to matter one bit. Now, you have to ask yourself, why are they doing that in a deficit? I mean, we have a huge deficit. There's a huge interest that needs to be paid on the debt. I say we, North America, it's all the same. Canada, the United States joined at the hip, forever will be. Canada, USA, UK, it's like the triad, okay? We're all joined at the hip. We're all tethered to the big US ship, the US aircraft carrier. And when that gets sunk, we get sunk. So you have to ask yourself, why, oh why? What's so important about keeping this thing afloat? And the thing is, if they don't keep it afloat, the petrodollar tanks, everybody joins BRICS, which they are anyways, and they're really just expediting their own demise. They're expediting the demise of the US dollar by forcing all these other countries, because all these other countries see the writing on the wall. They're like, oh, look how they confiscated all of Russia's foreign assets. Look how they confiscated all of Russia's assets in US dollars. And look how they sanctioned everybody who went against them. This is what other countries are thinking, and this is why other countries aren't going to go for it. And this is really our own undoing. So, you know, in an attempt to save the whole petrodollar system and maybe have the serendipitous impact on LNG and boost the liquid natural gas industry in the United States and maybe reindustrialize the United States at the expense of Europe, who no longer are going to have an industry. And I guess they're just going to provide human services or learn to code or something like that. Because they're not going to have they're not even going to have the electricity to do that. I mean, unless there is a deal made soon, then lots of people are going to starve next year. Lots of people, Europe will be deindustrialized. There'll be a depression. There's going to be hyperinflation, not necessarily due to the printing of money. Well, I guess it will be the printing of money. It'll just be the scarcity of supply. There won't be enough supply. That's a scary kind of inflation, is that there just isn't enough stuff. And I don't know. Like I said, guys, this is more of a stream of consciousness type video. I don't really have a strategy for how I'm trying to present this information to you today. But on the one hand, in the macro sense, the war is still ratcheting up between Russia and the United States. It is not slowing down at all. But on the battlefield, it appears as though there's a period of calm approaching. Now, is it just the calm before the storm? When the ground freezes, are the Russians just going to go ham? Hard as a you-know-what? Is that what's going to happen? Is this the winter that they're going to pull out all the stops? Because, it's funny too how, well, not funny for the people who are impacted, but literally the day after the Russians met with the Chinese at that, was it Uzbekistan conference? They started hammering the critical infrastructure in Ukraine. And it was after the Kerch Bridge, it was after Nord Stream and things like that. But they just started gutting Ukrainian critical infrastructure. And of course, this is conveniently right around fall, right before winter. So if the Ukrainians did need to repair this infrastructure, they're not going to have enough time, really, before it has a real world impact on their ability to house and shelter and keep their population warm this winter. They're going to be in the dark in winter, which is just not sustainable, which is why they're talking about evacuating people. So are we looking at a long, dark winter, and perhaps there's this period of relief? But it still doesn't explain why the Ukrainians are parading the civilians in the streets. Now, if we project the most nefarious intent onto Ukrainian military strategists, it's the good old human shield thing, the Russians may be less likely to target these areas if there are civilians there, because it doesn't look good, right? So you keep a bunch of civilians, you bring the army in with civilians, which is probably something you shouldn't do. But who am I to say? I mean, what do ethics mean at this point? What does morality mean at this point? What does the Geneva Convention mean at this point? Because there's going to reach a point where, all those ideals, when it comes down to winning or losing a conflict where there's so much at stake, where literally the global financial system is at stake, and people worry about the U.S. losing hundreds of billions of dollars, but they stand to gain everything. They stand to lose everything, I should say, if they don't pour hundreds of billions of more. We're talking about trillions. The $1 trillion petrodollar system goes kaput if they don't invest meager $100 billion. But they've invested a lot of money in a very short period of time. A lot of money and resources. And it's not only the resources. I mean, we're looking at the street value of some of this stuff. But the thing is, in order to make a new Javelin missile today, it costs a lot more than it did just a few months ago, just a few years ago. Probably cost twice as much. And where are you going to make it? You're going to have to make it, I guess, in the United States, but where are you going to get all the component parts? You're going to be sourcing various things from China and abroad. And, I don't know. So anyways, what else is going on in the world today? Trump has told the media, or has told DeSantis crew to be ready for war. Well, I don't usually talk politics, but I can tell you one thing, is that there's nothing that the media would love more than Trump to be back in the White House. You know why? Because it's great for their ratings. Trust me. They might, on the surface, appear to not like him, but there's nothing that CBS, ABC, CNN, NBC, there's nothing they want more than Trump back in the White House. Mark my words. It's great for ratings. I mean, look what happened in 2020, right? That was probably the most ratings they ever got. Apparently, Putin is not going to the G20 summit. This is another thing. So he's not going to G20, which I didn't really think for security reasons he would go anyways. But you also have this situation where one of the foreign minister, I can't remember what his name is, it Patrushev? But he went to Iran recently. And, to go to Iran right now is pretty tense. But literally the day after the Kherson withdrawal, he went there. So that's almost saying like he had a green light. Like there's been some kind of agreement made, some temporary agreement. And there's even a limited amount of strikes right now across river. Now, I could be wrong. By the time this video gets released, they're lighting up Kherson like a Christmas tree. It could happen. But I'm just trying to give you guys some things to think about because something ain't right. Something ain't right. Now, if you take the Joel Skousen view, if you don't know what that is, well, go and check it out. I mean, he thinks that this is all part of the plan, right? To bring in World War III and, have one last... His whole thing is, okay, in the World War I, you got the League of Nations. World War II, you got the United Nations. They need a World War III to bring in the globalism thing. I don't necessarily believe that. Even though I used to think that the elites couldn't be that dumb to have a nuclear war, now I'm not so sure. Because the more I become a manager in life, the more I realize how incompetent people are at the top. It's not nearly as coordinated and contrived as you think it is. It's, there's a lot of haphazard stuff going on. So, anyways, the U.S. has conducted a provocative Arctic missile test aimed at Russia. Well, what a great time. If Kherson was a back channel agreement that was made between the U.S. and the Russians, would they be doing this Arctic missile test right now? Would they be doing all these exercises with the emergency alert messages and the planes going black and turning off all their transponders and all the nuclear war games and, all the stuff that's going on in South Korea right now? I don't know. The Russians are planning something. If they aren't, then maybe they just don't have the resources. Maybe everything the mainstream media is saying is true. Maybe. Sorry, I'm not as, here's the answer in this video. Like I said, this is stream of consciousness only for the people who are paying attention. Even Dmitry Peskov has explicitly stated that Kherson remains a part of Russia despite the withdrawal. Remains a part of Russia despite the withdrawal. The region's legal status remains unchanged. That means it's still a part of the Russian Federation. Well, they must not see it as an existential threat yet. They're still talking about taking Crimea back by next summer, and it looks as though they could be on track. Again, it's possible. What else do we got here? Let me tell you about the Austerlitz scenario. Actually, you know what? I only have 50 seconds left. Guys, keep on prepping, man, because I'm thinking this is the calm before the storm, but let me know what you think. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. And I'll leave you on a good news, okay? Russia and U.S. to hold first nuclear talks since Ukraine war. November to December, somewhere in November to December, apparently something was brokered in Cairo. But I don't have enough information really about this, but they're going to be talking about the New START treaty. But is this just both sides, playing the game to try to bide their time? I don't know. You guys let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.